Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This session is called Montana Legal Research, and I just want everyone to know that it is being recorded. And so this presentation is being recorded. Things that are said are going to be recorded. So with that in mind, I would like to sort of welcome everybody, those of you online and those of you that are in person. For those of you online, one thing that I'm going to do right now in the chat feature is I'm going to put a link to a PDF document. You all maybe have already received this, but I want to just make sure that everybody has access. This is a handout that is basically the speaking notes that I'll be using as we go forward. You should be able to download that PDF and follow along. For those of you in the audience, obviously, I've printed these out and they will kind of be our guide as we go forward. Let me introduce myself. My name is Franklin Runge. I am the state law librarian for Montana. I have been here since January, so not very long, which is super exciting for me to be here. This has been a wonderful transition for me professionally, intellectually, and also in the community of lawyers and judges in general public that I've met thus far, even in my short time here. To give you a little bit of background, I come from started actually working for the courts in Massachusetts as a law clerk there, and then practiced in a small firm that did civil litigation, mainly plaintiff side, large actions against cigarette manufacturers and also automotive manufacturers on seatbelt safety issues. I was the sort of person in the office that did everybody's legal research. And I was like, well, why don't I just do that for a living? And I jumped out of practicing law and went and got a master's degree and went into academia, which has all sorts of pluses and minuses and interesting moments. So I worked at the University of Kentucky and then Washington and Lee University before coming here. My teaching experience focused on 1L students. And so frequently I would have to tell the 1L students, like, what you're writing down is not important yet. I'll tell you, they would be so rapt with attention, trying to get everything they say because they were so nervous. And then I taught 2Ls and 3Ls, and I just had a hard time getting anyone to even appear to class sometimes. And so now that I'm sort of teaching in front of practicing attorneys, like, I'm ready for you all to just throw stuff at me, or, like, I don't know what that transition looks like, but I will say I'm thrilled to be here. It's an honor to kind of be in front of you and talking about this topic today. If there are questions, do not hesitate, for those of you in the live audience, to raise your hand or shout out. For those of you on Zoom, feel free to put it in the chat. And there are strategic pausing points throughout my presentation that I'll come to, and then we'll check the chat and see if they have enlightened questions that they have for us to sort of unpack. But I'm thrilled to sort of have this be a give and take. And also, if I start seeing things that are unclear, I'm happy to sort of have clarifications as well. So one thing I am going to sort of share my screen now for those of you online. And what I'm going to do is, let's see if I can do this. All right. And here, let me see if I can move. Okay. What I want to do is there's, there we go. I want to move that down there. Perfect. So I'm going to, for those of you on the screen, you can see the PDF handout that I'm working from, and I will be navigating to other websites and using different legal research platforms throughout the presentation to sort of make it sort of more relevant and actually see this in practice. Legal research is something that is very hard to learn if someone is just talking at you. I mean, honestly, it's something that you learn when you're doing. And so I recognize that for this hour, I'll be doing a lot of talking, but hopefully with some, moments in between in which we practice some of this or see what it looks like, it'll kind of come to life and start to click together. Here are a couple of things that I think about legal research and the way that it is done in practice and done and taught to lawyers. We're going to have a range of talent on this subject. One of that is just people's comfort level, and also people, how they were taught to do it, whether by someone or whether they self-taught themselves. There's some incredible, I kind of consider myself, I had to kind of teach myself. My law school just didn't sort of focus on that. And that's something that we can really challenge legal education about. It was like, well, what about practical skills? But that's a challenge that we will always kind of work with. So there are some individuals in this audience and online who have very basic understandings, or maybe were never challenged or have never challenged themselves. And so I'm going to say some things that are very fundamental, very basic. And I'm sorry for those of you that are super experienced, but to kind of live through that, but to make it up to you, to sort of make it manageable for those of you that are more experienced, I'll kind of hopefully embed inside of my talk moments in which we unpack why on earth things look or act or are put in the places that they are. So, there's this whole like, oh, how you can do something. That's what we all need to be able to do with legal research. We need to know how to do it. The next sort of level in sort of a hierarchy of thinking is understanding why it is that way. Historically, how did it get to that point, and sort of what's going on with it? So I hope to sort of embed moments with that. The other thing I hope to do is show you as many sort of low cost or free alternatives. I am happy that we have Lexis in the law library, and we also have Westlaw access in the law library. And so I'm happy to talk about those as platforms, but there are also many places to find legal information outside of those major vendors. And so I want to kind of highlight that as well. Okay, I am sort of ready to sort of jump into a couple of things. One of the things that I want to start with is, if you remember nothing from this entire talk, I want you to remember the following thing, is that your suffering when it comes to legal research is optional. I'm going to say it again. Your suffering when it comes to legal research is optional, in the sense that you have a team of people at the State Law Library who are information experts that are happy to help you navigate whatever sort of topic that you bring to our table. And there are a lot of you that are self-sufficient, doing amazing work. I'm thrilled for that. But there are also many moments, and one of the beautiful parts of the law is that we're exposed to new things all of the time. Who realized 20 years ago that drone law would require so much energy, right? There's all sorts of new things. And so turning to the law library when you're faced with a challenge, I'm someone who is, an expert in nothing, but I know a lot about everything, right? So I can kind of hopefully get you to the resources that you need. And when I say, I once again reiterate that the team here at our law library, our reference librarian, all of the other staff do amazing work. And so I want to kind of make that the impression, is that you have a team of people who are ready to help you. I want to now talk a little bit about how I envision the research process. And this is a very basic, rudimentary vision of sort of how we do it. The problem that comes up, of course, is that research is a recursive process. You're always having to sort of, after you learn about the law, all of a sudden you know better questions to ask your client about facts, right? So but here is my general process, this phase one of understanding the facts, trying to understand the issue, understanding your procedural posture, your procedural issues that come from that posture, and then The final thing that I kind of do when I start a research project is to place the issues inside of a hierarchy of legal authorities. What on earth does that mean? That means that I think about I start by thinking about the silos of, is this federal in nature? Is this Montana in nature? Or is this another jurisdiction? So I just start by understanding, hey, where on earth is my problem? And does my problem ever sort of escape the neat boundaries? Does it require me to look at other jurisdictions or into federal materials? And then understanding what's going to be binding and what's persuasive, right? Getting down to that idea of like, understanding that the Constitution guides it all. And then that's actually at the top of, most of us don't do constitutional litigation. So you can kind of move on. But if I'm just sort of ranking what I need to look at, constitutions, statutes, regulations, cases, and that sort of vision of that primary law. So putting inside of your vision of the problem, what am I ranking in the things, and how do they relate together? What's going to be binding, what's persuasive? My second step is secondary sources, everyone. There's been some studies completed recently about how people do legal research. And one of the things that they're finding is that inexperienced lawyers, generally with 1 to 5 years experience, start their research by looking for cases. They're just like, I better kind of find cases on this matter right away. People with experiences of 5 years or more start in secondary sources. And it's because they know enough to start by thinking about, well, what does an expert say? What does an expert on this subject say? And so that vision of time-saving analysis, that vision of getting a lay of the land before you get to the primary law, this is time-saving, this is building foundational knowledge, and also building for yourself a vocabulary about how experts talk about the issue. And sort of that's something. So always starting in finding and analyzing what secondary sources. Of course, those secondary sources have footnotes and internal citations that will hopefully guide you to the cases you need. But as we know, that some secondary sources sort of maybe aren't updated or refreshed in the way that we like them to be. So you're going to have to get into primary sources eventually. The next thing, my next phase is analyzing the primary sources and sort of recognizing, and we've kind of gone through them and we'll look at them again, Constitution, statutes, regs, and then judicial opinions. And then our final point here is just using a citator to make sure that what you're citing is good law. And what I think is, I love thinking about how powerful a citator is. And, it does two things. Number one, it determines whether what you're looking at is good law or bad law. So that, or whether it kind of adds dimension, with those sort of distinguishing cases. The other thing it does is it expands your research. If you're using a citator, you can not only find additional cases, but citators will give you book chapters, treatises that talk about the subject that you can get to. And a lot of people don't kind of remember, like, oh, well, I have this case on this topic, but I don't really know enough about that topic. Get to that case, get into a citator, and see if it's talked about by an expert somewhere. I'm going to stop for a moment and check our chat. It looks like someone has asked a question. What is the definition of a citator? Yeah, it's like, I love this question because it is this weird monster in that a citator is a machine on platforms that checks to determine, it gives sort of a vision of whether a case has been distinguished or overturned or has been has been overturned by a statute. It sort of gives you that information, which is of course important for professional responsibility so that you're not citing bad law. But it is this sort of, if you get into thinking about what actually a citator is too much, it's in essence, every case is given, this identifying number, a citation, and then through the rest of its life, it is tracked, sort of like NSA surveillance forever on cases is like, well, what happens to it? What is, what's being said about it? So that's what that is. All right, let me go down to the chat again. Is that the same as shepherdizing? Yes, that is the same as shepherdizing. All right, secondary sources. I'm going to shift my discussion now to and we started talking a little bit about their importance. This idea that you stand on the shoulder of giants when you learn something. I want to talk a little bit about where to find secondary sources. And the most surprising thing that happened to me when I moved here to Montana in January was realizing how few Montana secondary sources exist. There's this sort of like when you practice in other states, you're like, oh, I'll just go to the practice series. And there's like 3 different practice series for the state and then you get here and you're like, oh, well, I better kind of figure out ways to cobble together my best options, right? Or as I've labeled this section in the handout, any port in the storm, and sort of figuring out the best way. Let me say this. If you remember nothing about secondary sources, remember that you may not actually have a great knowledge of what all of the different copyright treatises are out there, or criminal search and seizure treatises out there. But is that something that the law librarians know? Yes. So if you're in a topic and you're like, hey, I need to know more about cannabis business practices, and you're like, well, where does that even start? Or where do I find secondary sources? You can always reach out to a law librarian. And we're happy to say, here are 3 different options that I found that we have available. Or if we don't have it available, let me see if there are ways that I can get you access from other libraries of how to get information. So once again, if you're like, well, what secondary sources do I even use? Remember that that's something that I think a lot about. I'm always looking at and trying to understand how our collection can do better on it. On that note, I'm going to now on the screen, I'm going to navigate to the Law Library of Montana. Here's our website. It's at the judicial branch's website, courts.mt.gov, and then there's the library feature. I'm going to sort of move down and sort of look at what is called the digital library. And I'm going to open this up in a new tab. And this digital library is available to you if you have a law library card. So if you have a Montana Law Library card, normally when you click here, it'll ask you to log in with your law library card number. And then when you do, you will then have access to hundreds of treatises, or about 100 or so treatises on a variety of topics. This resource, I recognize that many of you in the room or on this Zoom are state employees. You all have access to, a law library card, and you can get access to this. I want to say that those lawyers that are not employed by the state, you can get a law library card because you're a bar member, and then you can then access all of these, for free using your law library card. One of the reasons why I might use this resource is you can find many of these treatises on the Lexis database, but I like looking at it in this format because it reads a little bit more like a book or old loose leaf, maybe like what you're used to. And I feel as if your reading comprehension can kind of improve when you're looking at it in ways that kind of look more like a book does versus scrolling on a website. So if I go to browse library, you can see under torts, we have 23 titles, or employment law, etc., family law. And so what I want to do, and I just would recommend this as a resource for individuals that are looking for treatises, and it's just a good option on that front. As I say, Lexis Advance and Westlaw also have a number of treatises. If we think about the two databases, the greatest difference between the two of them, obviously is the color of them. But then the second greatest difference is the different secondary sources that they have. They started off, West and Lexis started off as book publishers before they had online platforms. And they had different sort of stables of authors that they worked with. And so that is your greatest difference between the sort of two options, is what secondary sources are inside of them. And then when West and Lexis turned into online platforms, all they did was dump their books, whether that be case books or statutes, or whether that be treatises, they just dump them into an online format. I will say this, many of you state attorneys that have access to Lexis, I hope that the secondary source coverage is good and that there are treatises that are relevant to your practice areas. But the other thing that you might consider is, hey, are there moments in which Westlaw just has better material on this subject? Is Westlaw's search and seizure treatise going to be that much better because it's maybe more recognized or cited by courts? And so what I want you to feel comfortable with doing, I want you to feel comfortable occasionally, if the mood strikes you, reach out to the law library and ask us, hey, I've been looking at this cannabis treatise, I've been looking at this eminent domain treatise. Is there a better one that you all have either in your library or available on your Westlaw terminal? And we can sort of do our best. We make that available to you all in the law library, and you can download whatever from it and take it back to your office or email it back. There's a question here in the back. Yes, Norm.
Just wondered, according to your secondary services, the Lexis Advance, you say employed by the state, but I think just a minute ago you said that if you have a law library card, you can also access Lexis online?
You cannot access Lexis. With a law library card, you can access a digital library of secondary sources.
So we can get Lexis or Westlaw.
Exactly. At the law library, we provide free access to anyone, whether you're state employee or not, to West and Lexis. If you are at home, if you have a law library card, you can get to our digital library, but you can't actually get to the platform unless you're an employee of the state who has access. So thank you for that clarification. There's a question in the Zoom, if you'll give me a moment to check the chat. Can a paralegal don't have a bar number? I'll respond to that. We do not issue to paralegals. If you're working with an office that has an attorney, we can check out books to that individual. Best way for anyone to get a state law library card. Our law library is devoted to state. We issue cards to individuals that are licensed by the bar and state employees. And you can email the law library, and I'll kind of show you where that contact information is, and we can provide that, or email or call us. Okay, one point I want to leave you with also on secondary sources, with two more points quickly. Books. There are a number of books that are not published by West or Lexis. There are other publishers in the world, and in legal information, Walters Kluwer, James Publishing, PLI. So there are some books that are in our collection that you cannot find online. And so that's another thing to kind of keep in mind as you navigate through your looking at secondary sources, is don't get chained to a computer. Call us, stop by, email us, and say, well, do you have other things in your collection on this topic? And we have a I was surprised at how good the law library was in its collection when I appeared here. I thought, small state, how much money are they going to have for this sort of thing? How much, what sort of management have they had? And the history of this law library includes some very good librarians and a great commitment from the judicial branch to have a robust, healthy collection for the size of the bar that we are and the size of our state. I mean, it's really good stuff. And so there are a number of materials that you might not be able to find online that we can locate for you here. And we can scan chapters for you, or you can come over and use our scanning materials and get that information to you. Finally, when you can't find Montana-specific secondary sources, which happens, that happens a lot to me when I'm trying to sort of explain or understand something, and how do I navigate away? Some of the things that I've been turning to, and I made this sort of list here, are these relatively large and amorphous secondary sources that that some people might kind of have a hard time even understanding what they're looking at. I'll say, here's my list of the American Law Reports, or what's called the ALR. The ALR is in its sort of 7th series, and they also have a federal series. They're very large. They are available in Westlaw and in Lexis, and we have them in print. They're so expansive, and they are updated regularly. It's hard to navigate them in certain ways. This is when I recommend getting to an index. The ALR index is, the print volume is the easiest one to navigate, but West and I believe Lexis has an online version of the index of the ALR. I never search the ALR just itself because it's so expansive. It's going to return way too many results, and it's going to be confusing to navigate. I always use an index of trying to get to the best ALR articles. Inside of ALR articles, the kind of what I love about its structure is frequently it sets up the dichotomy that you see with courts when they're making decisions. For example, if you're looking at an ALR article on fair use of internet materials, the article is going to be broken down into moments in which the court has found that it's fair use over photographs, and moments where it has not found fair use. It's going to be broken into fair use in fine art, where the court has found it, and where the court has not found it. And that's often, that's the kind of gold we look for when we are practicing attorneys, is like, well, where's the court found for and against, so I can make my arguments, of my persuasive arguments, and also my distinguishing arguments from if it's the side I don't agree with, right? So ALRs are like, they're amazing. Other ones I mentioned here, causes of action, AmJur proof of facts, AmJur pleading practice and forms annotated. These are, they're really bizarre books in certain ways, in that they try to cover so many materials. But what I love also about the ALR or causes of action or the modern trial or the AmJur trials is that they're pretty specific. They get pretty granular in how they approach issues. And so as opposed to just saying, oh, I need an article about fair use, it would be more like fair use on the internet, so that you can kind of get a little bit more sort of broken down. So ALRs have been really helpful. And the other nice thing about ALR is if there is a Montana case on point, they're usually going to try and indicate that. It's not 100% perfect, but the authors are trying to do this 50-state survey inside of 50-state and also federal survey inside of their ALR articles. Okay. Other things that I'm now going to sort of turn to looking at primary law. So as opposed to, once you do your secondary sources, we turn to, let me do my primary law research. Here we look. All right, I'm going to stop for a moment. Any other questions at this point? I don't see any online. Okay, great. I'm actually going to have a quick sip of water. Great.
Let me just ask.
Yes.
I tend to take the same approach you do, I think, with secondary sources, especially when I don't know anything about the area of law. But I find that I've done that and missed things when there's a statute or a rule that addresses a point and I've glossed over it. A lot of times the secondary sources, especially because they're not often based in Montana, will not cover a Montana specific law or rule. So I would quibble a little bit. I would go to statutes and rules, just a quick, at least a survey to see if there's anything on point before I went to secondary sources, if I knew enough about it.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question for those online. The question generally was, hey, sometimes these secondary sources don't have Montana materials, so it's important for me to look at statutes, do a quick survey of what Montana has said, or if it's in a common law issue. And it's almost like you have tossed me a big softball of why this is the next stage, is that you can't always trust everything that you've read in the secondary sources, that you have to do your due diligence. That's part of your professional responsibility, is that after you look, you then jump over to your primary law and do a quick survey or an intense survey, if you have to, of what the primary law in your jurisdiction is, whether what it's saying or not saying about the issue. So I do, but I try and start with the secondary sources to save time and save energy. But I always then switch over and, trust but verify what's being said and what you're learning. And the other, so I would just, I think I've answered the question. And I want to just talk a little bit about how we examine the primary sources.
I have a question.
Yes.
Does the state law library have access to local, state, district court rules? Not rules, but decisions?
Okay. The question for those of you online was whether or not the state law library has access to district court decisions or lower court decisions in Montana. So if I am in Lexus, I can go under cases. I can go to Montana. And when I am in the Montana cases here, Lexus's coverage includes Supreme Court cases, district court orders, and water courts. Notably, though, that's not every district court trial order. It is, I am unclear on how the trial courts identify what's going to go into a database or not. That's a mystery that I wish I knew, and I probably should know. So that's something I'll work on, everybody. But like how those are selected to what goes into, but we do offer this. The other thing, this is not fantastic. Oh wait, we have someone from the.
Actually, on that same point there.
Yes.
Are you noticing a trend of which things are kind of there in the trial court orders?
All right, so the question from the audience for those of you online is, am I noticing trends or patterns about what gets captured and what does not get captured? No. I wish that, once again, this is something that I probably should know. And so that's something I can sort of look to, but it's also trying to understand our state's relationship to a sort of large vendor and sort of where I can sort of stick my nose into that relationship or not, right? So, but it is interesting. If we think about the court has just released sort of public access portals, and this gets your ability to see what is going on in particular trial courts in the district court or the limited. But remember, this is public access. Your information on that is going to be limited to basically docket information and not click through into materials. But at least it can give you a clue if you're familiar with something going on. Question from the audience.
I talked about the law from a little bit about this public record portal, but is this primarily those courts, reflecting those courts that are on the file system?
Okay, the question is, does this public access portal reflect what the e-file system is showing? I don't know 100%, so I can't say for sure, but that seems to be what would make sense to me, is that they're now able to sort of get from the case management system over into something that is available in a public format. There is a question online. Will the district court decision coverage change as more courts move to e-filing? That's a question from the audience here. That seems like that would make more sense as more courts go in an online format, and it's interesting. Yes, I think that is what we are looking for. There are always curious things about what's made public and what is not, of course. Family issues, other types of sensitive cases. But yes, I think we have seen how much Westlaw and Lexis have changed as things have started to be digitized. All of the unpublished decisions from like the Ninth Circuit or the Fifth Circuit, all of those just sort of didn't exist really anywhere until the internet kind of came to be and say, you know what? The reason why Westlaw and Lexis weren't sort of managing unpublished decisions before was that's way too much paper, way too many books. About 85% of circuit court cases in the feds are unpublished, maybe even a little larger in many districts. And so, it would be backbreaking work for the publishers to capture all of that unpublished material. Now that they can just put it online on their platforms, we've seen them change in that way. Okay. I'm going to go back to the Law Library's website. All right. So when we think about our examining primary law, our sort of first stop is this. Here we go. Our first stop is understanding the state constitution. I'm going to get cheesy here for a moment about Montana. I am in awe that there was a constitutional convention in the 70s. In the 70 Constitutional Convention is the act that occurred in the early 70s is amazing to me that this state and its population were that empowered to make an important change. I mean, I always teach constitutions and with students, we think about like, well, where does the power of the Constitution come from? And I say sheepishly, well, the people. And here in Montana, I don't have to say that sheepishly. I can actually say that really proudly, like, oh, the people of Montana actually are so invested in their democracy and so invested in their functioning of government that within, many people's lifetimes, it's the fact that this happened, 50 some years ago is unbelievable and makes it sort of a beautiful thing to think about, is that if we think of the states as laboratories for democracy, Montana is an awesome state to live in on this front. And I'm sorry to be cheesy about this, but it is, even within my time of living here in 4 months, I've had 4 or 5 months now, I've had more interaction with my representative and senator than I ever had anywhere else I've ever lived. Boston, Virginia, wherever, like I just was so detached from our government. And that's a beautiful thing that happens here. Okay, I'll quit gushing about this issue now, but it's really kind of awesome to be around, is to see a democracy that still has an engagement and a size of a population that can engage. All right. I want to talk for a moment about how I look at thinking about the Montana Code Annotated. Montana Code Annotated, what I love about our Montana Code Annotated is it's a dumb name because it's not annotated. The actual book of the code is not annotated. There is a separate book called the Montana Code Annotated Annotations, right? So why we couldn't get this in one book but I think it's great that we have them. But so you really, making sure that they're read together, because that, you getting that context from the annotations is what's valuable. And here's another thing that I'll say about Montana that is awesome, is that Montana publishes its statutes and it publishes its annotations. Many states don't do that anymore. Many states sort of have offloaded that onto private publishers, and they don't even own, the private publisher can't own the law because the primary law cannot be copyrighted. But the idea that we own, not only do we own the law and make it freely available, but the state of Montana actually owns its annotations and makes it available for everyone, is a real incredible service of freeing government information and making legal research that much better, that we don't have to pay Western Lexis to look at annotations about our law, is really kind of an awesome thing. So, why do we look at those annotations? I always sort of say, all we do, lawyers, all we do is we fight about what words mean all day long. We fight about what words mean all day long. And so getting into those annotations is, of course, one of the most valuable things you can do when you're looking at a statute, to sort of understand the context of course, the legislature is really proud of its statutes that it brings forward and thinks like, oh, these words will clearly solve all of our society's problems when we enact it, when we quickly realize that everyone can have very different interpretations of what those words mean. And so the annotations provide us that context. I would like to kind of point out that the law library on our website, if we go to Montana Resources, and if we go to the legislative branch, one of the things that we have here is we have digitized all of the versions of the print volumes. And we've worked with the Montana State Library on this project. They're an incredible crew. And we have worked with, so if we open this in a new tab, if you're somewhere and if you need to sort of quickly look at Title 42 of the Montana Code, we have digitized all of these books. And what I like about this is it reads, look, you're looking at it just as a book is. So if you're away from your code book, you can jump into this resource, download, look at however you want to, however you want to look at that. And we have this available. And of course, there's also the online version that the legislature puts out from their website. This is harder for me to navigate personally. I'm someone who, when I'm thinking about a code, how interconnected a code is from section to section, I hate looking at it in a web format. I always want to look at it as it's read in the book. I want to be able to flip back and forth pages and look at those sections, right? Kind of scrolling and trying to navigate in an HTML is just a lot for me. So there we have, that's where this is. And I'd also like to indicate that we have also scanned and made available the annotations. And so if we go to that, you can jump into the annotations to the code as well. Question in the back.
Does the law library currently have available online the folios version of the code?
I do not think that we have that available online, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look. Norm, how about we talk? The question was whether we have available online the folios version. I'm aware of that product, but I think that for some reason, I think that the law library is licensed to just a small number, and I don't think that we make it freely available, but I'm not sure. But I can look into that and let you know. Okay. Looking at the code here, in sort of understanding this, I'd like to just sort of also indicate while I'm on the law library's page here, thinking that if you scroll down, we have the bill information. We have just sort of understanding the legislative minutes and exhibits to sort of statutes. And one of the things I think is helpful for some individuals is these tables of going from the revised code of Montana to the Montana code annotated and then back again. So if you're trying to track something that occurred, prior to moving to the MCA, a lot of times it's just hard to get the numbers lined up. And here we actually have some conversion tables so that you can understand, well, wait a minute, if this was a particular section in the RCM, where can I find it today? Or, hey, let me march back in time from the MCA and go back and look at what the old code would have looked like. We have also digitized the RCMs. And so if you look at, here is digital versions of all of the old historic volumes as well. Once again, I'm super excited about how that project is looking and turned out. And so you can go back in time here to get to the historic RCMs as needed. Of course, as I've said, you can always contact the law library. You can email us, call us if you're looking for sort of older statutes. We're happy to do this, or or direct you to where you could possibly find us here. Okay, statutes. I would be remiss if I did not indicate that we also, the law library, one of the things that I'm shocked at is our legislative histories. And we have historically, we had staff members that would put together incredible legislative histories on many sort of chapters that are past each legislative session. You can always contact us, and we are happy to sort of email you. If we have one made up, we can kind of get it to you quickly. Of course, if you require one to be sort of done for you, that's another process that we can kind of talk about later. But I'm really sort of amazed at the amount of legislative history that we do have pre-made, ones ready to go. So I will stop there for a moment, and I'm about to transition to talking to you about cases really quickly. And let me look in the chat. What would trigger you to know what you need, that you need an outdated section of a code? Can I give an example? I mean, the example that I run into a lot, of course, is tax issues. At least federal tax law changes so much depending on how your client is sort of navigating what they're doing. You're going to have to figure out what the statutes were, what the code was, at the time of your client's matter or tax filing year. The other thing that kind of comes up, I think, a lot would be criminal matters of like, oh, well, that, what was actually law back when the conviction occurred in 97? Or, there's a lot of kind of figuring out, when do I need to sort of march back in time about a code? And a lot of time that is, well, when did the legal problem sort of have its genesis? Or there are moments you might want to march back in time on a code if you're thinking about the history of that code and how it has changed over time. Might get into a more sort of interesting appellate level argument, but you never know. I have no idea. So I hope that helps. Question, yes.
Can you tell if the governor has signed the punitive damage bill that was passed?
Okay, the question was, can I tell if the governor has signed a what type of damage bill?
Punitive damage.
Punitive damage bill. At this moment, I probably cannot do that live because I would just sit around here and fumble for a little bit. But if that was on the governor's desk recently, I usually track the governor's signings on the Montana newsroom because he posts everything that he signs onto the Montana newsroom. So, so if I'm thinking about where that is, I mean, there's another way that we could get into the governor's website to get a sense. I don't know off my hand, and it would take me a moment or two of fiddling. So, but good question. All right. I want to transition quickly to talk about cases. We have, I want to try and end at about 12:55 so people can kind of get to wherever they're headed, and also if there are questions. So I'm just going to take a quick talk about how I look for judicial opinions. And, one of the strongest way, I think, to look for judicial opinions is using the organization systems that West and Lexis have placed over top of how cases are organized. Inherently, cases are going to be a disaster to try and organize because they're released chronologically by a bunch of different courts, either high courts or lower courts. And, you know, is there any rhyme or reason to like when they put things out? It's not like in July, they're like, here's all of our criminal cases. You know, August, we'll do the civil ones. Like, no, they are, every type of case is released when it is released. And the amount of cases being released each day is huge. A huge generation of paper, you know, across the country in all of the courts. So the organization system that we're looking at would be in West, it is called key numbers. And in Lexis, it is called head notes or topics, head notes and topics. So what I want to do is sort of walk you through that issue of course, you can sit here and sort of type in words of, hey, I'm looking for a Montana state case and I can try a search. But I also want you all to be aware of, if I'm in Lexis, I can go down to topics. And in topics, here's my organization of what is available. They have evidence, if I'm looking for an evidence issue, and admissibility, and conduct evidence. If I was interested in prior acts, crimes, and wrongs, or habit, routine, and procedure. So if I go to prior acts, crimes, and wrongs, it comes back with so many results, you're going to lose your mind. Because when you go through this, it's capturing everything that the country has done. And so you have to be good with using, if I go to my court and going down to state courts, you have to start limiting what you're looking at. So if I get to Montana, I can quickly get down to 298 cases on this topic. And this is covering Montana. If we look at this, if we look at Montana again, give me a moment. Sorry, you all. I did not mean to do that. If I get down to Montana, I have 240 from the Supreme Court and 58 from the district. So I might just say, let me get rid of that, and I'm down to 240. And you can begin searching across these results if you want. You can organize them. They're organized by relevance. You can also organize them by court and date. And so we can see a recent decision on this topic. And the other thing I want to kind of point out here, which I always think is interesting, is looking at this Ravel view. And it shows you a timeline of the cases. In the largest circle of the cases are going to be those that are cited the most. So you can navigate to this and quickly see, you know, what year. You can kind of see year, in the bubbles indicate number of citations. So this is using, I want people feeling useful using topics to get to sort of cases. Finally, I want to kind of point out how to do this. In Lexis, in West, you get into the key number. And I only have screenshots up here because I don't have permission to have my West open up here, right? I have to be down in the law library to do that. So sorry that we have some screenshots, but if you're navigating to the key numbers in West, you know, we get to evidence. I'm going to look for exactly the same topic, but in West versus Lexis, I can get to evidence, and it shows you, I get to evidence, and I want to look for admissibility. And so we get into evidence of similar facts, transactions. Notice that in West, you have a lot of, it gets very It gets very detailed in those numbers. In a way, I would say West is using a scalpel to get into how the topics, and Lexis is a little bit more of a broader overview. And so in either one works, but there is this sense of when you get into the West key numbers, and the reason that is because the key numbers have been going since like the 1910s. They've been around a long time, whereas Lexis's overlay is a little bit later in the process, just because West has been publishing cases for a longer period of time. So you get down into more detailed and specific sort of visions on that. And so you can get into finding other crimes, acts, and wrongs, and getting to cases that are very narrowed on these topics. The point that I would make about these key numbers, most of the time when I am trying to do, well, I think back when I was litigating crap, I mean, one of the things that I would frequently have a problem with is when you're trying to say something that is obvious, that everybody knows, but you just want a dang citation to back you up. And I think that what West does really nice about this is this sort of amorphous in general. And a lot of times you'll see at the top of most topics, this sort of in general category. And they have it a lot of times on, for example, if you're looking at civil procedure in the key numbers or statutes or sort of very large basic things that you're like, I need the court to just say the basic sentence about what this topic is so I can feel good in citing. That in general category is frequently where I turn. All right, we have reached 12. Oh, we do have a question from the audience.
In Westlaw, is it state specific? Can you go to Montana?
You can go to Montana. Absolutely. When you get to what you're looking for, you can filter into just Montana or Montana and related federal cases that are out of Montana or Ninth Circuit. So you can try and make those connections. And I'm happy to sort of walk through that with anybody who would have a question about that. So we are at 12:57. It has been wonderful. It's to see you all. Thank you for being here. I wanted to indicate quickly that the Law Library hopes to be offering CLEs that are throughout the year. So be on the lookout for emails about upcoming ones. I think next month, the team from the Montana Legal Services is going to be doing, MTLSA is doing something on landlord and tenants, and we're hoping to do legislative updates and also some stuff on mediation and some other topics. So check your email for that. And once again, this CLE was submitted for to the bar, to the CLE a couple of weeks ago. They have to just approve it, and I will send everybody's information in that has registered online, and people who signed. If you're in the audience, make sure you're signed up there, and I'll submit all of that to the bar. And so I appreciate your time and thank you very much. Have a great weekend.